Well, welcome everyone to the Miller Center Forum. Our guest today is CIA Director in the Obama administration for the second term, Mr. John Brennan. We're so pleased to have him with us today. I'm Barbara Perry, and I'm the Director of Presidential Studies here at the Miller Center, where I also co-chair the Presidential Oral History Program with my colleague Russell Riley. And we were just saying to Director Brennan in the green room that the Miller Center has conducted presidential oral histories of every administration going back to Gerald Ford. And as you come up the steps or as you exit today, notice the picture of that oral history, which includes a very young Dick Cheney, a young Don Rumsfeld, and as we like to say, Brent Scowcroft, who never looked particularly young, but we were so glad that they came down in the late 70s after the Ford administration. And then we started into the Carter administration, and we've done every president, whether Democrat or Republican, since. We're now in the midst of the Obama administration, which brings me to my colleague and friend Spencer Bakich, who is joining me here today on stage to chat with Director Brennan. Spencer comes to us from the Virginia Military Institute, where he is a professor of international studies, as well as the director of their National Security Center. He and I go back almost 2 decades from our time at Sweetbar College in the government department there. But because of Spencer's expertise, including a book that he's written on limited wars, America's so-called limited wars, starting with Korea and coming up to more recent wars, because of that expertise, we began calling on him when I came here a dozen years ago to participate with us in our oral histories. So he has done interviews with our teams for chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, vice chairs of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, secretaries of defense, and most recently with Director Brennan. We were really pleased that Director Brennan gave 2 days of his time to chat with us about his experience in the Obama administration. The reason that we called him here for this particular day is that, as you might have seen outside, we have a new edition of his book. This is the slightly older edition called Undaunted, and the subtitle is My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad. It's a New York Times bestseller, and he has updated it to include a chapter on January 6th, 2021, and the attack on the United States Capitol. So he has graciously offered to sign his books, and I'm sure you can have a little chat with him if you would like at that time. And then speaking of interaction, if you are online, go to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom and submit your questions. We will set some time aside at the end of today to try to get through some of those. And if you're in the Miller Center today watching, you have at your seat a piece of paper that you can use to write your questions on, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So you might wonder about the background of Director Brennan. We were just talking about, sadly, the passing of Queen Elizabeth, but I said to him as a 100% Irishman, how did he feel about that? He comes to us from his native New Jersey, where he was born, the son of immigrants from Ireland. So he had very nice things to say about Queen Elizabeth in terms of her reign, but perhaps we could have a little chat about, he said they're still looking for those 6 counties in Northern Ireland to be given back to the Republic. He also has a common background with me in that we have both a Catholic education, but he went all the way through to Fordham University. I went on to a public university. So he has a classical Catholic education that only Jesuits can provide from Fordham. And at that point, he thought he had already an interest in the Middle East. He had spent a junior year abroad in Cairo studying and traveling throughout the Middle East. He was learning Arabic. So he thought that he would do graduate work in Middle East studies, did a master's degree at the University of Texas at Austin, thought he might go on for a PhD, but decided he would serve his country. And so signed on with the CIA and went on to an almost 3-decade career in the CIA with a host of different positions, some of which I'll just cite to you. One was to be the executive assistant to George Tenet. He also was the president's daily briefer in the Clinton administration. He became the CIA chief of station in Saudi Arabia. He was the CIA deputy executive director. He was the founding director of the Terrorist Threat Integration Center and became the interim director of the National Counterterrorism Center. So because because of all of this background, it is the reason that Barack Obama chose him to be an advisor to him in the first term in counterterrorism matters and homeland security. And then, as I say, for the second term, was nominated to be the CIA director. And I know you've seen him as a commentator across a number of channels on television. And so please welcome him here today and thank him for his service. Well, with that, Director Brennan, we want to start with your book. How does someone who has spent his career in the CIA, well, let's face it, keeping secrets, how do you write a memoir?
Well, with great difficulty. I wasn't planning to write a memoir, and I said that once I retired finally from government service that I would just retire quietly. But then people talked to me about how fortunate I was to work in the government on so many important national security issues, and that I would help to contribute to the general knowledge about that chapter of our history. And so I decided I was going to write a memoir. Many other former directors have, most of them I think have. And different than my predecessors, I wasn't allowed to review my files at CIA because at the time, Mr. Trump was not a fan of mine and decided to prevent me from accessing my files. So I didn't have the benefit of being able to review my files, the records at CIA, the way previous CIA directors did. So I had to rely on my memory as well as discussions with my former colleagues, as well as a review of open source information that tended to trigger my memory about some of the activities that took place and developments during my time in government service.
Well, I have to tell you, Spencer and I, as we get ready for these interviews that we do for Presidential Oral History, have read a slew of memoirs, and this is one of the best. It's very compelling. It's very accessible. I have to tell you, one of my favorite stories on the funny side is that when Director Brennan was new to the CIA and was learning how to go undercover, and they, of course, outfit people going undercover. So his practice day, where they gave him a wig and glasses, and he wondered why people were looking at him rather strangely as he went through the day. And only when I think when he got back in the car and looked in the mirror, the fake wig with the fake sideburns, he had forgotten to tuck under the glasses. And so they had been sticking out parallel to the ground the entire day. So I think it's safe to say that he didn't go on to rise to the levels that he did by being undercover. But that's just an example of, in addition to the many serious stories, of course, that he has to tell in the book that you will enjoy. So tell us then about the new edition. What is new about the new edition? And if I understand correctly, you said that one thing that you added was a chapter on January the 6th, 2021. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, the epilogue is entitled Truth Matters. And I talk about January 6th, but it really focuses on how harmful and insidious disinformation has become in our political and social culture. How individuals, whether they be politicians of whatever stripe, or political pundits or influencers, will intentionally propagate false information as a way to advance a partisan, personal, or political agenda. And I just find that very, very damaging to our nation, because it's really difficult for American citizens to really understand what the truth is when they're hearing such falsehoods coming out from people that they believe would be much more respectful, I guess, of the environment and not spew that type of disinformation. Throughout the course of my government career, I had to deal with propaganda and disinformation coming from the Russians and the Chinese and the Soviets before them and so on. And so we were always trying to counter that propaganda. But now I fear that the greatest threat on the disinformation side is coming from within our midst. And that's why I really try to emphasize in this chapter just how unfortunate it is that there are individuals who resort to that type of disinformation. Misinformation is information that may be pushed out that people don't realize is false. But disinformation is, again, the intentional the dissemination of information that they know to be false.
I sometimes add to that malinformation that has a really sometimes even evil intent, it seems to me. So here we sit in Charlottesville, where in 2017 we were invaded by a group of, for want of a better term, Nazis. Many of you know my mentor, Henry Abraham, was a Holocaust survivor and lived a ripe old age of 98 and passed in 2020, just as the pandemic began. But in 2017, he who had run from the Nazis in 1937 for his life and at age 15 said, I can't believe I'm seeing this again. I can't believe this is happening again. And shortly thereafter, he had settled in Pittsburgh. The Squirrel Hill Synagogue shooting happened, and very near to where he had settled as a Jewish refugee. So we know what it's like firsthand to see that kind of activity here. From what you've discovered in your research on January 6th, do you think that this is likely to happen again?
Well, hopefully it won't happen on the scale that happened on January 6th in terms of the assault upon the Capitol, which is the symbol of America's democracy and freedom. So I do think that the security forces and services in the area of the U.S. Capitol and Washington, D.C. will be better prepared. But I must say that it's very unfortunate that so many individuals are willing to resort to violence in order to advance their agendas. And what we saw here in Charlottesville, as well as what we saw on January 6th, is unfortunately the polarization that has taken place within the United States that pits sides against each other really, I think, is very antithetical to what this country is all about. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the rhetoric that individuals use incites that violence. And it's clear that the masses, the thousands upon thousands of people that gathered around the Capitol and in DC on January 6th did not happen to show up there coincidentally. They were encouraged to go there. And I do think that a lot of the rhetoric, the language, the narratives that were pushed out really incited that type of insurrection. And unfortunately, I don't think we've learned the lesson yet from it. In the immediate aftermath of that insurrection, a number of individuals stood up in the U.S. Congress and said, "That's it. I'm, fed up with this type of, the language that's coming out from a particular segment of the political spectrum." But they seem to have forgotten just how disastrous that event was, I think, for this country. And unfortunately, I don't think that they are calling out the real culprits who I still tend to, I think, incite this potential for violence as they call into question the integrity of our electoral process, the integrity of the institutions of government, the integrity and professionalism of law enforcement and intelligence professionals. And so these are the people who I think are continuing to abet and to pour fuel on the fires that unfortunately sometimes do result in acts of violence.
Well, it so happens that Director and I are the same age cohort, and we were talking about coming of age in the 60s. And in the 60s, we saw this kind of violence, certainly on the left. When you were in the White House advising President Obama about Homeland Security, were you looking at all different kinds of threats, not only from abroad and certainly in the global war on terror, as it turned out, again, we saw in 2017 here in Charlottesville and on January 6th from the right. Did you ever have to think in terms of what could arise from the left?
From the left or from the right?
From the left.
From the left.
Again, akin to what we saw in the 60s.
Yeah, as you said, I grew up in the 60s, grew up in New Jersey. And so it was a state where there were a lot of race riots. And I could feel that the sentiments were there and seething, that manifest themselves in the streets. When I was in the Obama White House during the first term, I was his assistant for counterterrorism and Homeland Security. And so I had to be cognizant of not just the threat that is coming from abroad, but also domestically, whether it be from the left or the right. And the United States history, unfortunately, I think has had a series of its chapters where there has been violence that is coming from the left or the right. And so one of the things that I had to do at the White House was to work very closely with the Department of Justice and the FBI to ensure that although we were focused on preventing these attacks from Al-Qaeda and other types of foreign terrorist groups, that we were aware of what was going on domestically. It's a much more difficult challenge, though, dealing with these domestic acts of violence, because they are perpetrated by American citizens. And there is this tension between security and privacy and civil liberties. And the government has to be very mindful that they cannot overstep the boundaries of their authorities in terms of intrusion into the lives of American citizens. And so sometimes if there's hate speech or if there's, comments that are made publicly, it doesn't mean that someone's going to resort to violence, but you really do have to honor the guardrails that are not going to allow the FBI or others to intrude upon, again, the privacy and civil liberties of American citizens, which happened in the 1960s, clearly, on repeated occasions. So I like to think that the government has learned some of its lessons over time, and these institutions are made up of people. And as we know, people are imperfect and institutions are imperfect and they'll make mistakes. Unfortunately, I have seen in recent times that there has been an attempt to try to manipulate these institutions of governance by politicians and public officials in order to advance their own partisan or political agendas. That is reprehensible in my mind. And so I work with some dedicated individuals across the spectrum of U.S. society who worked in FBI, CIA, Department of Justice, and other places. And it's, again, very unfortunate that too often their integrity, their honesty is impugned, but also it's very unfortunate that too often there are attempts to try to exploit their authorities to advance the agendas of individuals or political parties.
Well, we want to turn to some hot spots in the world now. And to do so, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Spencer Bakich, with a lot of expertise in these areas and have him throw out the first query.
Well, thank you very much, Barbara. Director Brennan, I can't imagine a better person to pose a couple of important questions, I think, about the conflicts that are going on in Russia, the war in Ukraine, as well as the increased tensions in the Taiwan Strait. But if we could focus first on Russia. Thinking about your particular expertise as in intelligence, you dealt extensively with the Russian FSB, with the Russia's internal intelligence and security services. You write in your memoir about how you interacted with the head, Alexander Bortnikov. The Washington Post had an interesting set of stories that came out just a few short weeks ago, detailing extensively how the FSB got so much of the intelligence wrong about the nature of Ukrainian resistance, the ease with which this operation supposedly would go for the Russians. And I wonder if you could shed some light on just how it was that the FSB, which is focused extensively on Ukraine, got it all wrong.
As you point out, the FSB, which is the Internal Russian Security Intelligence Service, it still has responsibility for intelligence in the former Soviet republics, and that's why it's the lead agency within Ukraine. And clearly, they badly misjudged the ability of the Russians to just roll over the Ukrainians. I think it was, bad sourcing, a bad sense of just how outraged the Ukrainian people would be. But also, I think it may be in authoritarian systems. Frequently, individual leaders of certain institutions are reluctant to bring bad news to the boss. And so I think Vladimir Putin was determined to carry out this invasion. And probably the FSB thought that even if their intelligence wasn't all that accurate in terms of how many Ukrainians would welcome the Russians, that the vaunted Russian military would be able to roll over the Ukrainian forces in blitzkrieg-like fashion. Well, they didn't. And I think Putin badly miscalculated not only the reaction of the world to what was going on, but also the Russian military really didn't have experience in carrying out a multi-pronged military campaign the way they launched in Ukraine. For better or worse, the United States military, because of Afghanistan and Iraq, has tremendous experience as far as how to bring together air and ground operations, do combined arms, do the logistics that are necessary to be able to push a military forward. The Russians didn't have any of that. They had some sophisticated weaponry. They had a lot of people, a lot of arms. But to carry out something like this in a coordinated manner, clearly everything was falling apart. They didn't have the logistics. Their leadership was very, very weak. Their incompetence was quite clear, and they weren't able to coordinate their battlefield operations. So the Ukrainians were able to take advantage of that early on. But also, even though the US and European military support to Ukraine really didn't start to flow until after the invasion, there was a fair amount of support on the intelligence front to the Ukrainians. So they were able to let the Ukrainians know the access roads that the Russians were likely to take, how they were going to carry out this multi-pronged campaign. And the Ukrainians had a much better ability to have these mobile forces go and bog down these Russian forces. So I think from a number of perspectives, the misjudging on what the Ukrainians could do, misjudging on how well the Russian military was going to perform, it just was a debacle, which is why you saw that Putin then redirected his forces just along the eastern and southern areas. But just over the past several days, Ukrainians are rolling over Russian forces. And that's a result, I believe, of some of these very, very sophisticated and longer range military weapon systems that the United States has provided, the HIMARS, the howitzers, and other things that are wreaking havoc in a lot of the Russian rear lines. And so the rear lines are not able to support those frontline troops. So I'm hoping that this momentum continues. I'm hoping also that there's increased criticism now of Vladimir Putin inside of Russia, including by those who formerly were supporting him. I'm hoping that this is going to lead to his undoing, because I don't see an exit ramp for him. I think there's an exit ramp for Russia, but only if Putin is pushed out of the leadership position.
That poses a different set of strategic questions, doesn't it? A weak, fearful Putin, fearing perhaps maybe needing to gamble for resurrection to increase his standing. Do you have any particular concerns about a wounded and vindictive Putin that is facing the brunt of a Ukrainian counteroffensive that very well may completely rout the Russian military?
Yes, I think the more desperate and cornered he gets, the more likely he is to resort to some tactics or decisions that I think he would like to avoid. There's always the question of whether or not he might opt to use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine. I didn't think that was likely. I still don't think it's likely. However, he is an evil and vindictive person. If he feels as though he's going down, might he try to cause as much damage as possible against Ukraine that led to his downfall? He clearly doesn't care how many Ukrainians or Russians die as a result of this conflict. And so, again, if he sees the writing is on the wall that he is going to be overthrown or turned out, what might he do? I don't think he's going to try to provoke a fight with NATO forces. Because clearly his military performs so poorly. He doesn't want to go up against NATO forces that are qualitatively head and shoulders above Russian forces. But again, might he do something to try to just bring the entire region down or even the world down? I hope that's not the case. And I hope that there are enough Russian officials that will prevent him from doing that. Unfortunately, the people around him, like a Bortnikov, like a Gerasimov, the defense minister, and then others, are in the same boat as he is, and they realize that there's going to be accountability for them. Will they take the possible step of trying to unseat him? I don't know. It might be from that outer core, maybe that next level of either the military or of the Kremlin hierarchy that might do it. But we'll have to see. But I think the coming weeks are going to be quite dynamic in some respects on the battlefield, as well as in the Moscow's decision-making circles.
Sure. It also speaks to, I think, the importance of the role that the United States can play in terms of its the policies, specifically of attempting to deter and dissuade Vladimir Putin from doing anything particularly reckless.
Spencer, can I just pause
Yes,
just one moment
absolutely.
before we leave Ukraine? Thanks to the leadership of Bill Antholis, who's here with us today. He was to be in Edinburgh, actually, to take his daughter to the university there. And there are some issues with visas, not to mention that there are some other things going on in Edinburgh right now. So we're glad that Bill could join us. But he's been running for the Miller Center and all of our many fellows as well. I should have mentioned that Spencer is now a fellow here at the Miller Center. What we're calling the Ukraine War Room. So all of the scholars here at the Miller Center and at the broader university have been discussing this ever since last February in the invasion. And we're also running what we call the Battle Symposium, and it's not meant to refer to a battle in a war, but rather for Ambassador Bill Battle, who was President Kennedy's ambassador to Australia. I had served with him in the PT boat service in the Solomon Islands. And so Barry Battle and her family set up this Battle Symposium that every 2 years we run on a topic particularly related to foreign policy. So this fall it will be specifically on Ukraine, and so pay attention to your emails and your information coming from the Miller Center about that, because we think that's important. Before we leave Russia and that hot spot, because we have others to cover today, but before we do, it seems like the perfect opportunity to talk about not just Putin and foreign policy as it relates to what he's doing in that part of the world, but you mentioned that as part of your career you were having to follow from the then Soviet Union, from the Chinese, their propaganda, their attempts to interfere in our elections, for example. We know that you have studied this very carefully in reference to particularly the 2016 election. Can you talk to us about that, your discoveries? And that has generated, we must say, from the right, some criticism. So we don't want to just to let it lie at that, but your thoughts about it, and then how do you respond to that criticism?
So the Russians have always tried to influence U.S. elections. In years past, they did it through typical types of propaganda in terms of newspaper articles or journal articles, or getting somebody to say things on the radio or the television. But in this digital realm, it has given the Russians and others so many more opportunities to exploit that information environment in the United States to be able to push forward their views. In 2016, the CIA, as well as the FBI, detected an increased effort on the part of the Russians to try to influence the outcome of that election. And so as CIA director, I was able to see all of that intelligence, very highly sensitive intelligence, that clearly indicated that Vladimir Putin made a decision to engage the Russian intelligence security services in propaganda efforts to try to undermine the integrity of our presidential election, hurt Hillary Clinton's chances of election, and try to increase the chances that Donald Trump would be elected. They did it through various means. And so the U.S. government was trying to thwart those efforts, but at the same time, it's a highly charged political environment. And Barack Obama, as the titular head of the Democratic Party, wanted to make sure we didn't do anything as we were investigating and trying to uncover what the Russians were doing to try to tip the balance in that outcome of the election. It's incontrovertible to me, based on what I saw in the intelligence realm, that Russia did try to interfere. There was repeated evidence of collusion, and which the Mueller report that ultimately came out identified. And there were a number of individuals, Russians and Americans, who were indicted for illegal activities related to that 2016 presidential campaign. There were also things, though, that were not as evidentiary, that unfortunately I think a lot of folks on the right have used to dismiss what actually was taking place. For example, the Steele dossier, which was compiled by a former British intelligence officer, that alleged that there were a number of things on the personnel front of Donald Trump, and that they were never proved, those allegations there. But the other intelligence that was available, that the CIA, that NSA, that FBI had, clearly indicated that there was this interaction. And the Mueller report, when it came out, Bob Mueller, who didn't pull the financial threads and other things, said that there wasn't the evidentiary base in order to charge anybody with conspiracy, because conspiracy is actually a crime. Collusion is not a crime. Did I see things based on my own reading that were unethical, un-American, unprofessional? Absolutely. But what the CIA's responsibility was to turn it over to the FBI, because CIA was not going to investigate what American citizens working for particular campaigns were doing. That's up to the FBI. And unfortunately, there were some missteps, I think, by the FBI that have been acknowledged. Some of the FISA applications that weren't as strong as they should have been. But clearly, the FBI investigation that was opened in late July of 2016, there was a strong basis to do that. I think it would have been a dereliction of duty if there wasn't an effort on the part of the FBI and intelligence community to try to uncover what Russia was doing in that 2016 election. Thankfully, I think there's been a fair amount of work to try to prevent the Russians from doing similar types of things. And it's because of the professionals in FBI and CIA, Department of Homeland Security, and other places that make it much more difficult for the Russians to do that. But there is no doubt in my mind that the Russians were determined to try to influence the outcome of that election. And I do think that they were fairly successful in terms of pushing out in that digital realm, in the social media realm, a lot of personas that came across as, good Americans that were saying certain things, but it was Russian intelligence that was pushing out that information that was shaping the attitudes, the sentiments, and the votes of Americans. And there was a very close election, as you know, in 2016. If the Russians didn't interfere to the extent that they did, would have the outcome changed? Might have. It's a hypothetical, though I don't know. But I do know that the Russians were determined to try to get Donald Trump elected, even though they thought he was a long shot. They wanted to hurt Hillary Clinton as much as possible before the inauguration that they thought she was going to have, because they saw that weakening the president-elect, the new president of the United States, was going to help them as they continue to pursue their global agenda.
Spencer, let's turn to the Middle East.
Sure. So you've spent a good chunk of your career working in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You write in your memoir, interestingly, your first interactions with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, right now. At the time, you indicated that he was confident, perhaps arrogant, but one of the things that struck me was you didn't necessarily think that he had the influence in the region that he thought he had when you first met him. Would you change that assessment of MBS at this point?
No, because what I was saying is that I remember my meeting with him very vividly when the war in Yemen was raging. Mm-hmm. And it was when he was working for his father in the defense ministry. He was the one who actually advocated for this Saudi military push. And he told me that he was going to clean up things in Yemen in a couple of weeks or a couple of months the most. And then he's going to turn Saudi attention to clean up the situation in the north, meaning Syria and Iraq. And I think, as I said in the book, I didn't know what he was smoking, but I knew that his ambitions, and he had a very exaggerated sense of what Saudi Arabia could do as far as influencing events in the region. Mm-hmm. He clearly is a very, very dominant character. He has been able to manipulate the political system in Saudi Arabia, and so he is the day-to-day leader there. He was able to push aside his uncle, then his cousin from the Crown Prince slot, and because his father is king. He is a very, very ambitious individual, a very narcissistic individual. The horrific murder and dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, Washington Post columnist. I am convinced, having worked with Saudi intelligence for many, many years, that they would not have done that without the explicit direct authorization from Mohammed bin Salman. And so I think he is willing to go to any extent in order to advance his own personal political interests and agendas. But I think he has come to realize that, yes, Saudi Arabia is big and powerful. They have a very big checkbook, obviously, and they do exert quite a bit of influence in the region. But that doesn't mean that he's able to shape developments in a very troubled region of the world the way he would like to.
Okay.
Again, I think he is in charge right now of Saudi Arabia. And when Salman passes away, I don't think there's much doubt that he is going to become king.
Dr. Brennan, if you were in the Biden administration and had been in there a few months back, and President Biden had come to you to say, I'm considering traveling to Saudi Arabia, and meeting with MBS, what would you have said?
I advocated, I think publicly also against it, that the U.S.-Saudi strategic relationship is critically important, and that needs to continue. But I think given MBS's role, not just with the murder of Khashoggi, but also what has been happening domestically in Saudi Arabia, the suppression of political activists. And also I would think that there's a fair amount of torture as well as killings that have gone on inside of Saudi Arabia at his direction. I did not like the image of President Biden meeting with MBS. Now, I think the Saudis required there to be that type of photo op with the fist bump. And this is where presidents have to make some really tough decisions. So as an intelligence professional, national security professional, I would have provided my perspective, as I did to other presidents that I had served. But then the president has to decide what is in the best interest of the country, looking at the national security dimensions of it, looking at the economic issues, the political issues and other things. And President Biden made the decision. I do not fault him for it. It was one that he felt that he was needed to make. And so, looking at it, I guess, objectively, I don't think there was any harm that, was a result of that. But, sometimes American presidents have to meet with repugnant counterparts around the globe, whether it be a Putin or others. And this is what realpolitik is all about, is trying to ensure the United States is able to operate on the world stage in a manner that is consistent with our values as a country and is consistent with what is best, our best national security interests. And sometimes you have to be able to reach out to those that you find otherwise have carried out some detestable actions. This is why I think the Biden administration is trying to revitalize the Iran nuclear deal. That despite the fact that the Iranians continue to engage in some really, offensive behavior, stopping that Iranian nuclear program is critically important. And therefore, you want to do what you can in order to achieve the objectives that are going to be in the best interest of the United States. So again, I would have counseled against it. But I think I would have, thinking of the White House Situation Room where those National Security Council meetings collect, I think that I could understand how others would have said, Mr. President, yes, we know you called Saudi Arabia pariah and MBS, pariah, but U.S. national security interests really demand that we be able to get over this hump right now with Saudi Arabia.
In about 10 minutes, we'll turn to questions. So we want to remind folks online to send in their questions Q&A function, and folks here in the room as well to write out your questions. And if you want to hold up your card at some point, my colleague Alfred Reeves IV, who's in the back of the room there, will come and pick it up and hand it on to us. Let's turn to another hotspot. Let's go to the Far East.
Sure, absolutely. So over the course of the last few months, relations between the United States and China have been particularly difficult over the issue of Taiwan, including and in many respects exacerbated by Speaker Pelosi's decision to visit Taipei. As a former intelligence chief, what are the types of things that you would urge American citizens to think about when it comes to the possibility of conflict across the Taiwan Strait?
Well, first of all, I would encourage American citizens to become as informed as possible about the facts, the history, to realize that although our country is so strong and we are protected by these two large oceans, and tremendous capabilities at home, there really is an international environment that the United States has to nest within, and that China is quite ascendant, not only in the region but in the world, and is in direct competition, if not potential confrontation with the United States in so many areas. And the island of Taiwan that is not a sovereign state that we recognize. It's again, the history is important to understand how we agreed that there would be a one China policy, that we would continue to provide support to Taiwan and have interaction with it, but we wouldn't have diplomatic relations with it. But we are very much opposed to China taking over Taiwan and swallowing it. Taiwan is an area where such a large majority of the world's semiconductors are produced. It's a technical electronic treasure that I think China lusts after. And over time, it has been slowly trying to and incrementally dominate not just the region, but also incrementally, I think, have Taiwan be absorbed within a larger China. Speaker Pelosi and others are trying to signal that although the United States has had a policy of what's called strategic ambiguity, in terms of if China were to invade Taiwan, would we respond militarily? We generally, deflect that question, although President Biden, I think a couple months ago, said, yes, we would. Yeah. And then they walked that back a bit. But clearly, we don't want to encourage China to take any type of aggressive military action against Taiwan. It certainly would not be in United States interests or global interests to do that. I do think that China does not want to have an invasion of Taiwan because they want to swallow it. Look at the destruction of what's happened in Ukraine, even though Putin says he wants to bring Ukraine back into that Russian orbit. And it would be a very, very bloody and costly fight. And the Taiwanese are not going to be a pushover whatsoever. But I do think we have to send a strong signal to China that they can't just use their muscularity in order to take over other states, and Taiwan being a critically important one. So I do think the next several years are going to be fraught with a lot of tension between the United States and China. I do think the Biden administration understands that the relationship with China is multidimensional. You have trade, you have economic issues, you have the political environment, you have Taiwan, you have cyber, you have so many things. And you don't want to just condemn China across the board. There are areas where I think we can cooperate, we can deconflict, we can reduce the tensions, but there are some areas where I think we have to say enough. And since China doesn't abide by a lot of the international rules and regulations, not just the World Trade Organization framework, but also other things, I think the United States as the, unquestioned leader of the free world, and of the global financial and economic system, we really have to be at the forefront of calling China out and preventing its further aggression on these areas.
Do you believe it's time for a change in that strategic ambiguity, the policy that has guided American approaches to Taiwan? Is it time to recognize and publicly state that America has a defense commitment to Taiwan in a way that we would know would rankle the Chinese?
Well, that's where you really have to be quite careful in terms of that balance. Just like the Pelosi trip, was it seen as provocative? Did the Chinese do certain things? They conducted military operations, on the seas and in the air around there. How far you go, that's going to be productive as far as letting the Chinese don't go past this, as opposed to provoking a more aggressive Chinese action. Mm-hmm. Again, I don't think the Chinese want to do anything right now, especially when they saw the international consensus that formed around the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Chinese really rely on the global economy in order to fuel their economic engine at home with their road and belt initiative around the globe. And they recognize that they cannot decouple themselves from the global economic order. So I do think that we have to make it very clear that Taiwan's integrity is something that is critically important to U.S. national security interests. Mm-hmm. The choice of words is very important. And Xi Jinping, who's up for another 5-year term next month, the Chinese are very, very careful readers of the language that we use. Mm. But I would not at all encourage us to step back from this defense of China in terms of the narrative and the language that we use, but I wouldn't encourage any type of provocative, more aggressive either actions or language that's going to potentially lead the Chinese to do something that I think they would not like to do, and we don't want them to do.
Right. So we still have some balancing to do for the foreseeable future. Mm-hmm. Okay, terrific.
You are very open in your memoir about your places on the spectrum, the political spectrum, the ideological spectrum over the years. Obviously, your roles at the CIA meant that you were not a partisan, but you were very open about the various presidential candidates you had supported, at least by your vote over the years, starting in 1976. And if you would like to talk more about that, you can. But what we pride ourselves here at the Miller Center for being nonpartisan. The university prides itself on being open to all perspectives. And yet you have, in addition to being open about various votes over the years, you also are open about the various presidents you worked with. And so since we have the current incumbent, Joe Biden, we've talked a little bit about him and his administration, but you had the opportunity of working with him up close and personal, particularly when he was vice president for 8 years in the Obama administration. So any thoughts you wanted to share with us?
I had the honor to work for 6 presidents. I got to know several of them very well. Obviously, I worked for President Obama for 8 years, but also President George W. Bush, as well as President Clinton. I was his daily intelligence brief for the White House, was mentioned earlier. George H.W. Bush, a former CIA director, I got to know very well after he left office, but also he was the first president that I visited and met with in the Oval Office back in the early 1990s. And I had tremendous respect for all of them. I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. I like to believe I'm a nonpartisan. And I disagreed with policy decisions that each of those presidents made at one point or another. But I always admired their interest in doing what they felt was in the best interest of the country. I never felt that they were trying to advance their own personal or partisan interests. And that's why I never believed I would be, but became quite outspoken in my last retirement, because I really felt that the things that Donald Trump was doing and saying were so inconsistent with the values and the responsibilities that I saw embedded in the office of the presidency. But I was at the White House last week for the portrait unveiling for Barack and Michelle Obama, and had a chance to speak with both President Biden and President Obama. It just brought back memories of just how well they worked together as a team, how they had to deal with some really difficult and challenging situations. And President Biden is still trying to navigate them. But I do believe that office of the presidency, to me, it's it's hallowed ground, and it's something that whoever becomes president of the United States really has to set aside their own personal or partisan interests. Now, clearly, they do have those interests, but on the decisions that matter, I felt that all the presidents that I had served really were doing things that they thought were in the best interests. You mentioned that I've been pretty transparent with some of my votes, even again, not a registered Republican or a Democrat. And I voted for Democrats and Republicans over the years, but my first vote was in 1976 as a new 21-year-old presidential, voter the first time, and I was already upset with partisan politics, and so I went into the voting booth and didn't know which way I was going to go, and went down the list of names, and I saw this name Gus Hall. I said, "Who's he?" And who was the Communist Party candidate at the time. And so I flipped the lever for Gus Hall, one of 57,000 people that year who did it. But years later, there was I was speaking to a recruiting group, and there was a young African-American student who raised her hand and said she's interested in joining the CIA, the intelligence community, and she's politically active on campus, and that political activism disqualify her from applying to the CIA. And I said, "No, it won't. And let me tell you a story." And I told her a story about having voted for the communist candidate in 1976. And sure enough, the media in the room, ignored all the things I said about the benefits and the value of working for the intelligence community. And the headline was, "CIA director voted communist." And so in the paperback version, the epilogue, I start off with a little story about when I was walking through the streets of New York, and a truck driver yells out the window, "Hey, you communist!" And it wasn't that clean. And that despite working 33 years in national security, it's that vote for communists, and people believe I'm a Communist Party member. I'm not. I was a 21-year-old rebellious kid from New Jersey.
Well, we were so glad to have a full house here today, and we had several hundred people sign up for our online webinar. We've got a couple of questions. Thank you, those of you who are out there in the virtual world. And one was on our list as well, then that is Afghanistan. And the Taliban's takeover, the U.S. withdrawal, the Biden decision, obviously, to leave August a year ago. Your thoughts about that?
Well, it's really the Trump administration's decision to leave in 2021 when they came to an agreement with the Taliban that called for the U.S. military presence to end in 2021 and drew down the U.S. military presence to like 2,500 troops. And then President Biden, when he came into office, extended the period from, I think it was April to August, or whatever, in order to give the U.S. military time to pull out more. And it was a decision that the Biden administration had to make, because the Taliban said that if you stay, we're going to restart operations against the U.S. military. And I think the feeling was that in order to prevent the deaths of American soldiers, that the U.S. would have to increase our troop strength again. And we go back into that cycle of, increased presence. And so they decided to pull out completely by, they were going to do it by September. They did it by August. And the focus was on trying to ensure the security of that retrograde, pulling out of U.S. military and contractors. And there was a psychological cascading as the Afghan people and a lot of people in the Afghan government and the military and security services realized, hey, the Americans are really leaving this time. And so all of a sudden, the institutions and the Afghan system of governance and security started to collapse in a rather quick fashion. And so, yes, it was chaotic at the end, and it was unfortunate that we had that one bombing there. Except for the bombing outside the gate, the United States was able to pull out its people securely and safely. A lot of Afghans decided that they were going to leave at the last minute. And so there was just this descent upon the airport that there were just so many Afghans who wanted to come to the United States or get out of what would be a Taliban-controlled country. So it's unfortunate that experience ended the way it did. But when I think about those 20 years that we were in Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda was decimated. We prevented a recurrence of those horrific 9/11 attacks. And at the time, Al-Qaeda was planning to have other waves of attacks, including against the homeland. And so I don't believe that the blood and the treasure that was expended on Afghanistan was for naught. It was difficult. It's difficult in a country like Afghanistan, in particular, to nation build. And I think the policies adjusted and morphed over time. It's one of the issues with the democracy. You go from one administration to the next administration, and they'll have different views and perspectives on it. And you don't always have a linear path or a consistent policy stream. But again, I'm very, very proud of the heroic work that was done by the U.S. military, U.S. intelligence community. I traveled to Afghanistan a number of times. We lost a number of officers in Afghanistan. It's a tribute to the heroism, the work that was done. But I like to think that the recent strike against the successor to bin Laden, Ayman Zawahiri, in Kabul, demonstrates that even though the United States does not have a military presence inside of Afghanistan, that we're still able to carry out these counterterrorism operations from over the horizon, which proved effective.
Well, we have from this in-house audience, can you comment, sir, on the intersection of technology and the CIA's challenge of conducting clandestine activities and providing cover to its officers and activities?
Oh boy, that's such a big question. And yes, there has been such a technological revolution that has transformed all our lives over the last 30 years or so. And so the CIA that used to be able to operate clandestinely by having a forged passport or forged visa and be able to go into a country and don a disguise and could operate fairly effectively.
Get the sideburn.
Yeah, right.
Get the sideburn,
Yeah,
right.
as long as they got the disguise right. Now, with this digital environment that you have not just machine readable passports and iris scanners and other things, but as you operate in these other societies, there is such a digital environment that security services can utilize. For example, your iPhone, that even if you turn it off, it can be tracked. And so let's say CIA officers who are operating overseas, and maybe they're operating clandestinely out of a US embassy. If our officers are told, well, don't take your phones outside because the local security service will be able to track your movements when you're going out to meet a source. If it's the CIA officers at a embassy, they're the only ones who are not carrying their phones with them, that's alerting in itself.
Yeah.
And so how do you operate within that very busy digital environment and do it in a clandestine way? When I was at the CIA as director, we reorganized. I created a new directorate of digital innovation because I recognized that digital environment has been so transformative and has had a profound influence on and impact on the intelligence profession, that I wanted to make sure that CIA officers were not only understanding what those challenges are that they face when they're operating overseas in terms of what foreign services can throw at us, but what is it that we can do in order to operate securely and clandestinely in this digital age. Thankfully, we have some of the world's best experts and technologists working in the US government, which is why I go out on university campuses and tell folks that, your country really needs the best and brightest in order to keep this country strong and safe. And, if you're a technologist, the agency or the military and others will really crave your expertise because we want to put it to good use. And that's why I tell a lot of the groups that I speak to, the students, to disregard all that political stuff that's going on in Washington, that a career in public service, in the national security realm, whether it be intelligence, military, diplomacy, or homeland security, any of them, really is, I think, critically important to, the future safety and security of this country. So.
We can't get away today without asking about the headlines and what you've been commenting on television. And speaking of national security and secrets, and that is the documents that were discovered at the home of the former president in Florida. Your thoughts, your concerns about that? When I
saw the first reports and then saw the first photos, I think, my jaw was on the ground. Looking at those cover sheets with those markings in terms of top secret and code word and all things, I know what those programs involve. Some of the most highly sensitive, highly restricted programs in the US government. And the fact that there was such disregard for the appropriate security practices that are needed in order to keep them safe and not disclosed, just I think underscores the recklessness and irresponsibility that unfortunately was in evidence during the Trump administration and following Trump's departure from the White House. And so I'm glad that a lot of these documents were pulled back, but after 19 months of being unsecured in Mar-a-Lago, and as I think I've said publicly, I am certain that the Russian intelligence services and other intelligence services saw Mar-a-Lago as a very inviting intelligence target after January of 2020. And it wouldn't take much to get somebody in a cleaning crew or a membership or a caterer or a visitor or whatever to, get a sense of what was going on in Mar-a-Lago. And again, I don't know exactly where those documents went, but it seems like they did move. When I worked in the White House in the West Wing, and some of those programs that were listed on those cover sheets, I was in the West Wing, which is protected 24/7, part of the White House complex. I was inside of a SCIF. That was my office, was a SCIF. And I had to keep those documents in a locked safe in my office. And if anybody came and needed to look at them, I would have to make a record of who saw them. Again, the fact that they seem to have been, tossed back into the residence so that allowed, the movers to move these things out, it gave me heart palpitations and continues to do so. And now there's obviously issues with the court and there's a call for a special master. I think it's going to be impossible for my former colleagues in the intelligence community to do a full assessment, because unless there was 24/7 video coverage of those areas where those documents were for the entire time, you're not going to know whether or not they were compromised. And so whether they're human sources that are at risk or highly sensitive and very, very expensive technical collection systems that might have been revealed in those documents, it's going to be difficult for the intelligence community to make some determinations about what they need to do in order to mitigate threats to human life or to those collection systems.
Well, I think you all can tell why Spencer and I felt so privileged to be part of an interview team for our oral history for the Obama years, not only to hear about Director Brennan's experience in that administration, but many administrations in his 3 decades of service to our country, for presidents of both parties and to our country in a nonpartisan fashion. And so we would like for you to thank him for being here today, coming down to Charlottesville. And if you will stay seated and let Director Brennan exit the stage so that he can go out to sign books. And again, feel free to go to your right as you exit and purchase one, and he will sign it for you. So thank you all again for being here and your questions.
Thank you.